A rejected auction horse stood trembling in the spotlight, and what happened next would shake the entire equestrian world to its core. The auction barn buzzed with the electric energy of wealth and competition, its polished wooden walls reflecting the gleam of custom belt buckles and hand-stitched boots that cost more than most people earned in a month. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of leather polish, fresh hay, and the unmistakable aura of serious money changing hands. Elite buyers clustered in their exclusive circles, voices low but confident, as they discussed bloodlines with the casual authority of those who had never known the weight of an empty bank account. Throughout the evening, a parade of magnificent horses had commanded the stage, each one more breathtaking than the last. Sleek thoroughbreds with coats that shimmered like liquid bronze stepped through the ring with the confidence of royalty, their heads held high, muscles rippling beneath carefully groomed hides that spoke of premium genetics and professional care. The crowd responded with the enthusiasm of gladiators in an arena, hands shooting up in rapid succession as six-figure sums were tossed around like poker chips. But now, as the evening crawled toward its inevitable end, something entirely different stumbled into the harsh spotlight. The mare's entrance was hesitant, almost apologetic, her hooves uncertain on the sawdust floor, as if she understood she didn't belong among the champions that had preceded her, where the previous horses had commanded attention through their obvious breeding and polished presentation. This animal seemed to shrink from the arena lights, her body language screaming of defeat before a single word was spoken. Her coat, which might have once gleamed with the rich warmth of autumn chestnuts, now appeared dull and lifeless, patched with bare spots where old injuries had left their permanent mark. Scars crisscrossed her legs and flanks like a roadmap of suffering, each one telling a story that no one in that privileged room wanted to acknowledge. Her mane hung in tangled clumps, her ribs showed through skin that had known too many hungry nights, and her eyes held the hollow look of an animal whose spirit had been systematically broken. The auctioneer, who had been animated and persuasive all evening, now seemed to deflate as he looked down at his notes. His practiced enthusiasm evaporated like morning dew, replaced by the uncomfortable duty of trying to sell something everyone had already dismissed. The crowd's energy shifted like a tide, going out, conversations resuming as wealthy buyers turned their attention to collecting their prized purchases and heading back to their climate-controlled barns. $50, the auctioneer called out with forced optimism, his voice echoing through the suddenly quiet space like a confession of failure. The number hung in the air like an insult, met only by uncomfortable silence and the occasional shuffle of expensive boots on wooden floors. A few buyers actually chuckled, their amusement cutting through the tension like broken glass. In the back corner of the barn, Marcus Chen stood motionless against a support beam, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Unlike every other person in that room, he wore simple work clothes that showed honest wear, the kind of fabric that spoke of dawn-to-dusk labor rather than boardroom meetings. He had come tonight more as an observer than a serious buyer, knowing his modest training facility couldn't compete with the financial powerhouses surrounding him. But something about this forgotten mare pierced through his practiced detachment like lightning through storm clouds. Beneath the obvious neglect and the weight of whatever trauma she carried, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. The way she held herself, even in her broken state, suggested an underlying strength that years of mistreatment hadn't quite managed to destroy completely. A single raised hand in that moment would set in motion a chain of events that no one in that auction house could have possibly predicted. Marcus felt his arm lift almost without conscious thought, the gesture emerging from somewhere deeper than rational decision-making. The number 50 left his lips before his mind could intervene with all the logical reasons why this was a terrible idea. Around him, the atmosphere shifted like air pressure before a storm, conversations halting mid-sentence as heads turned toward the back corner where the quiet man in work clothes had just committed what everyone considered financial suicide. The snickers started immediately, rippling through the crowd like wildfire through dry grass. A woman in a designer jacket leaned toward her companion, her voice carrying just enough to be heard as she questioned whether someone should check if he understood what he was bidding on. A man in an expensive suit shook his head with the kind of pitying smile reserved for those who clearly didn't belong, muttering about throwing good money after bad on an animal that was obviously beyond redemption. The auctioneer seemed almost relieved to bring his gavel down, closing what had become an uncomfortable chapter in an otherwise successful evening. The sound echoed through the barn with a finality that made Marcus's stomach clench. But there was no turning back now. He had just purchased a broken horse with money he couldn't really afford to spend, and every eye in that room was watching to see what the fool would do next. Leading her toward his modest trailer felt like walking through a gauntlet of judgment. The mare moved beside him with the mechanical compliance of an animal that had learned resistance only brought more pain. Each step seemed to require enormous effort, as if her legs were carrying not just her physical weight, but the accumulated burden of every moment of suffering she had endured. When his hand accidentally brushed against her neck while adjusting the lead rope, she flinched so violently that Marcus felt his heart break a little more. The contrast between his weathered pickup truck and faded trailer against the gleaming rigs of the other buyers was stark enough to draw more whispered commentary. As he gently coaxed her up the ramp, Phoenix, as he had already begun calling her in his mind, hesitated at the threshold. Her nostrils flared as she took in the unfamiliar scents, her entire body trembling with the kind of fear that comes from never knowing whether the next moment will bring kindness or cruelty. The drive home stretched endlessly through the darkness, broken only by the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional nervous shuffling from the trailer behind him. Each sound she made sent a jolt of anxiety through his chest, wondering if she was hurt, if she was trying to escape, if he had made a catastrophic mistake that would end with both of them broken on the side of some lonely highway. Doubt crept in like fog, settling heavy in his thoughts as mile markers ticked past. What did he really know about healing a horse this damaged? His modest facility wasn't equipped for the kind of intensive rehabilitation she would need. The bills would stretch his already tight budget to the breaking point, and there was no guarantee that all the time, money and heartbreak he was about to invest would result in anything other than a slightly more comfortable existence for an animal whose spirit had been systematically destroyed. But somewhere in the darkness ahead, Marcus carried a stubborn flame of hope that refused to be extinguished by logic or fear. Sometimes the deepest healing happens not through dramatic breakthroughs, but in the quiet spaces where broken souls learn that safety might actually exist. Phoenix pressed herself against the far corner of the stall like a shadow, trying to disappear into the wooden walls themselves. The 12 by 12 space that Marcus had carefully prepared with fresh bedding and clean water might as well have been a prison cell for all the comfort it provided her. She stood motionless for hours, her dark eyes tracking every movement beyond the stall bars with the hyper-vigilant awareness of prey that had learned the world held nothing but predators. The untouched hay in her feeder became Marcus's daily reminder of how far they had to go. Each morning, he would replace it with fresh timothy, and each evening, he would remove the same pristine pile, her refusal to eat a silent testament to the depth of her mistrust. The water bucket remained equally ignored, though he could see her nostrils flare occasionally when thirst warred with fear, her body's needs battling against the terror that accepting anything might somehow make her vulnerable to fresh torment. Days blended into a routine of patient persistence that tested every assumption Marcus had ever held about horse training. Instead of working with natural curiosity and the desire to please that most horses possessed, he found himself navigating around invisible landmines of trauma that could detonate without warning. A dropped bucket would send her scrambling backward until she hit the wall, her entire body trembling for minutes afterward. The sound of his boots on gravel made her flinch, as if expecting a blow that never came. Marcus began spending his evenings sitting on an overturned feed bucket just outside her stall, a worn paperback novel in his hands. His voice became a constant, gentle presence as he read aloud, never looking directly at her, never making demands or expectations. The words themselves didn't matter, but the steady rhythm of human speech, without anger or impatience, slowly began to chip away at the fortress of fear she had built around herself. Through careful observation, the pieces of her story began to emerge like fragments of a broken photograph slowly being assembled. The way she cowered when he raised his hand to brush a cobweb from the ceiling told him about blows that had fallen like rain. The scars on her legs spoke of rough handling and neglect that went beyond simple ignorance into deliberate cruelty. Her reaction to the sound of metal on metal suggested memories of harsh bits and brutal training methods that had taught her that human contact meant pain. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was so small that anyone else might have missed it entirely. On the 7th evening of his reading routine, Marcus noticed that Phoenix had shifted position slightly, no longer pressed quite so desperately against the back wall. Her ears, which had remained pinned flat for days, flickered forward for just a moment when he began the familiar ritual of opening his book. 2 weeks later, she took her first tentative steps toward the front of the stall while he sat reading, though she retreated immediately when he glanced up. But it was progress, microscopic and fragile, yet undeniably real. When she finally accepted her first apple slice from his outstretched palm, her velvet muzzle barely touching his skin before she snatched the treat and backed away, Marcus felt tears he hadn't expected burning behind his eyes. In that moment, he understood that healing Phoenix would require rebuilding her entire understanding of what it meant to exist in a world shared with humans. The moment when a broken spirit finally chooses to trust again cannot be planned or forced, but arrives like lightning in the darkness, illuminating everything that was once thought impossible. Months had dissolved into a rhythm that Marcus had never experienced before, each day requiring him to abandon every training method he had ever learned and forge something entirely new from the raw materials of patience and intuition. Traditional techniques that had worked with hundreds of other horses crumbled against Phoenix's particular brand of trauma, like waves against stone. Leading exercises that should have built confidence instead triggered panic attacks that left her trembling for hours. Groundwork that was designed to establish trust only reinforced her belief that humans were creatures to be endured rather than welcomed. So Marcus began to create something that had never existed before. A training philosophy built not on dominance or submission, but on the revolutionary concept of allowing a horse to heal at her own pace. He replaced halters with loose ropes that she could slip if fear overwhelmed her. Instead of demanding her attention, he practiced existing in her space without expectation, becoming as predictable and non-threatening as the sunrise itself. Every interaction was designed around her needs rather than his goals, a complete inversion of everything he had been taught about horsemanship. The exercises he developed were microscopic in their scope, but monumental in their intention, teaching her that a raised hand meant an offered treat rather than an incoming blow. Took 3 weeks of glacial repetition, helping her understand that human voices could carry kindness instead of anger, required countless hours of reading aloud while she processed this impossible concept. Each tiny victory felt like diffusing a bomb, delicate work that could explode into setbacks with the slightest miscalculation. The storm arrived on a Tuesday evening in late October, rolling across the valley with the kind of fury that transforms familiar landscapes into something alien and threatening. Thunder crashed overhead like artillery, while lightning split the darkness in jagged illuminations that turned the barn into a strobe-lit cathedral of shadows and fear. The rain hammered against the metal roof with such intensity that conversation would have been impossible even if Marcus had been inclined to speak. Phoenix stood rigid in her stall, every muscle coiled with the kind of terror that comes from being helpless in the face of overwhelming force. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her eyes rolling white as each thunderclap sent fresh waves of panic through her system. Marcus had seen this before in horses with trauma histories, the way natural events could trigger memories of human-inflicted suffering, blending past and present into an indistinguishable nightmare. Without thinking, he opened the stall door and stepped inside, moving slowly enough that she could track his approach. Instead of backing away as she had done for months, Phoenix remained frozen, perhaps too frightened by the storm to register his presence as a separate threat. Marcus settled against the far wall, close enough to offer comfort, but distant enough to avoid triggering her flight response. Then something miraculous happened. As another particularly violent crash of thunder shook the barn, Phoenix took a hesitant step toward him, then another. For the first time since that auction house, she had voluntarily chosen to move closer to a human being. She pressed her trembling flank against his side, seeking comfort rather than avoiding contact, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat as he realized they had just crossed an invisible threshold that could never be uncrossed. In that storm-lashed moment, surrounded by chaos and noise, two damaged souls found solace in shared vulnerability, and Phoenix began to remember what it felt like to trust. What emerged from months of careful healing would challenge everything Marcus thought he knew about the horse he had rescued from that auction ring. The transformation began so gradually that Marcus almost missed it entirely, like watching grass grow or seasons change in imperceptible daily increments. Phoenix's ribs, which had once pressed sharply against her dull coat like prison bars beneath fabric, slowly disappeared beneath layers of healthy muscle built from consistent nutrition and the kind of care that never wavered. Her coat began to catch light differently, developing a subtle sheen that hinted at the magnificence that had been buried beneath neglect and trauma. But it was her movement that truly caught Marcus's attention. The way her defensive shuffle gradually evolved into something that made him stop in his tracks and question what he was actually seeing. Where once every step had been calculated to minimize exposure and risk, now there were moments when Phoenix forgot to guard herself, brief flashes when her natural athleticism surfaced like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The first time he led her to the training ring, Marcus expected the same cautious, stilted gait that had characterized her movement for months. Instead, Phoenix stepped into the larger space and seemed to expand somehow, her stride lengthening with a fluidity that spoke of genetic gifts that had been suppressed but never truly destroyed. Her head lifted higher, her ears pricked forward with something that looked almost like curiosity, and when she moved into a spontaneous trot around the perimeter, Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The power in her movement was undeniable, each stride covering ground with an efficiency that seemed to defy physics. Her legs moved in perfect coordination, muscles rippling beneath her improving coat with the kind of rhythm that couldn't be taught or manufactured. This wasn't just a horse recovering from trauma. This was an athlete emerging from hibernation, her body remembering capabilities that had been dormant but never lost. Word began to filter through the tight-knit community of local horse people, carried on the kind of whispered conversations that spread through feed stores and tack shops like wildfire. Someone had seen something remarkable at Marcus's modest facility, though the details remained frustratingly vague. A mare moving with the kind of grace that made seasoned horsemen pause mid-conversation, her transformation so complete that she seemed like an entirely different animal from the broken creature who had stumbled through that auction ring months earlier. Marcus found himself fielding increasingly frequent visits from neighbors who suddenly needed to borrow tools or discuss completely fabricated concerns about their own horses, their eyes inevitably drifting toward the training ring where Phoenix worked through her exercises. He could see the recognition dawning in their expressions, the way their casual interest sharpened into something more focused when they witnessed her natural movement firsthand. But he kept his observations to himself, understanding instinctively that Phoenix wasn't ready for the scrutiny that would inevitably follow once word spread about what she was becoming. The trust they had built was still fragile, still dependent on the controlled environment he had created around her healing process. Too much attention too soon could shatter months of painstaking progress, sending her retreating back into the defensive shell that had protected her for so long. So Marcus continued their work in relative privacy, documenting her progress in a journal he kept locked away, watching with growing amazement as Phoenix revealed layer after layer of hidden potential that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface for someone to believe it existed. Sometimes the truest test of character arrives not in planned moments of trial, but in the chaos of an ordinary night when everything familiar transforms into something dangerous and unknown. The storm that swept across the valley that March evening carried with it the kind of raw fury that turns peaceful pastures into battlefields and transforms solid fence lines into suggestions rather than barriers. Marcus had secured Phoenix in her stall hours before the worst arrived, but even through the barn's thick walls, the violence of wind and rain created an atmosphere charged with the electricity of impending disaster. The emergency call came just after midnight. Tom Bradley's voice tight with panic as he explained that Lightning Strike, his prize Arabian stallion worth more than most people's homes, had broken through 3 fence lines during the height of the storm and was now running loose somewhere in the darkness. The animal was already injured, spooked beyond rational thought, and posed a danger not only to himself, but to anyone who tried to approach him in his current state of terror. Marcus found himself making a decision that surprised even him as he led Phoenix from her stall into the storm-lashed night. Months of careful observation had shown him that she possessed an unusual calmness in chaotic situations. But this would be the ultimate test of everything they had built together. As they approached the neighboring property, the sound of frantic hoofbeats and panicked whinnying cut through the storm like distress signals from a sinking ship. Lightning Strike was magnificent even in his terror, his silver coat ghostly in the intermittent flashes of lightning as he raced back and forth along a damaged fence line, his movements erratic and desperate. Blood streaked his legs where barbed wire had caught him, and his eyes rolled white with the kind of fear that makes rational thought impossible. Every attempt to approach him only intensified his panic, sending him careening into the darkness like a missile without guidance. Then something extraordinary happened that would be talked about in the horse community for years to come. Phoenix, who had spent months learning to trust humans again, stepped forward with a composure that seemed to emanate from some deep wellspring of wisdom. Her movements were deliberate and calm, each step calculated not to dominate or control, but to communicate in the ancient language that horses had spoken long before humans had interfered with their conversations. She positioned herself at an angle that intercepted Lightning Strike's frantic circuit without blocking his escape routes, her body language speaking volumes about safety and understanding. Her neck lowered slightly, her breathing steady and visible in the cold air. She became a beacon of stability in a world that had temporarily lost all sense of order. The stallion's wild galloping gradually slowed to a trot, then to a walk, his attention captured by this calm presence that offered sanctuary rather than pursuit. Within 20 minutes, Lightning Strike was standing quietly beside Phoenix. His panic subsided, his breathing returning to normal as her steady influence worked its mysterious magic. The injured stallion allowed himself to be led back to safety, guided by a mare who had once been dismissed as worthless, but now demonstrated a form of leadership that couldn't be taught in any training manual. By morning, word had spread through the community like wildfire carried on favorable winds. Marcus's auction reject had displayed a level of intelligence and emotional sophistication that challenged every assumption about what made a horse valuable. Phone calls began arriving before sunrise, voices that had once dismissed Phoenix, now asking careful questions about her background, her training methods, and whether Marcus might be interested in sharing his techniques with others. The horse world, it seemed, was finally ready to recognize what Marcus had seen from the very beginning. The truth that emerged from dusty files and forgotten records would prove that sometimes the most remarkable stories are hidden behind the cruelest circumstances, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to uncover what was always meant to be extraordinary. Marcus had spent weeks making careful inquiries, following paper trails that led through decades of sales records and breeding registrations. What he discovered sent a chill through his chest that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the barn walls. Phoenix wasn't just any mare who had fallen through the cracks of an indifferent system. She was the daughter of Midnight Thunder, a legendary racehorse whose name was spoken with reverence in circles where bloodlines were currency and genetics determined destiny. The records painted a story that made Marcus's stomach clench with anger so pure, it threatened to overwhelm his usual calm demeanor. Phoenix had been sold as a yearling to Blackstone Training Facility, an operation that advertised itself as specializing in difficult horses, but operated under methods that belonged in a darker century. The documentation was sparse, but what existed spoke of systematic brutality, disguised as professional training, where breaking a horse's spirit was considered the first step toward making them useful. Her breeding papers revealed that she carried bloodlines worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Genetic material that represented generations of careful selection and championship performance. Yet somewhere in those early years at Blackstone, her value had been systematically destroyed through techniques that valued submission over partnership, fear over respect. By the time she had reached that auction house, her papers had been conveniently lost, her identity erased, her worth reduced to the $50 Marcus had paid for what everyone assumed was just another broken animal. But the numbers and documentation told only part of the story. The real revelation came in understanding what Phoenix's survival actually represented. She hadn't just endured trauma that would have destroyed lesser animals. She had somehow preserved the essential core of who she was meant to be. Beneath the scars and defensive behaviors, beneath the months of careful rehabilitation, the genetic gifts of her legendary father had been waiting patiently for someone to recognize their existence. Marcus found himself staring at Phoenix with new eyes, seeing not just the mare he had rescued and healed, but a living testament to the resilience that existed in the deepest places of the spirit. Her bloodline was valuable, certainly, but her story was priceless. She represented proof that healing was possible even after the most systematic attempts to destroy what made someone whole. Her calm leadership during the storm, her gradual emergence from defensive isolation, her growing trust in a world that had given her every reason to remain afraid, all of this spoke to a form of courage that couldn't be bought or bred or manufactured. The phone calls from interested buyers began almost immediately after word of her bloodline spread through the community. Offers arrived that would have solved every financial problem Marcus had ever faced, sums that could have transformed his modest facility into something truly impressive. But each conversation felt like a betrayal of everything Phoenix had taught him about the difference between price and value. Standing in her stall that evening, watching her methodically work through her hay, with the contentment of an animal who had finally learned that food would always be there tomorrow, Marcus realized that Phoenix wasn't just a success story of rehabilitation. She was living proof that the deepest wounds could heal, that trust could be rebuilt, and that sometimes the most broken things became the strongest once they were given the chance to remember who they had always been meant to be. Her true worth couldn't be measured in dollars or bloodlines, but in the quiet dignity of a spirit that had refused to be permanently broken. The moment when success becomes a burden rather than a blessing reveals the true cost of recognition and forces choices that can either honor a journey or betray everything it took to arrive at that crossroads. The procession of expensive vehicles winding down Marcus's modest gravel driveway resembled a pilgrimage of the converted, each arrival bringing another industry professional who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness firsthand what they had initially dismissed as impossible. Trainers whose names commanded respect at international competitions stepped carefully around puddles in their polished boots, their eyes scanning the humble facility with the kind of intensity reserved for examining religious artifacts. Phoenix seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere before the first visitor had even stepped from their luxury sedan. Her ears remained perpetually alert, tracking movements and conversations with the hypervigilance of an animal who had learned that sudden changes in human behavior often preceded upheaval. The easy contentment that had characterized her recent months gradually gave way to a subtle tension that Marcus recognized with a sinking heart. The offers began arriving before the observers had even completed their evaluations. Phone calls and formal letters that spoke in numbers so large they seemed to mock the modest surroundings where Phoenix had learned to heal. Wealthy collectors who had ignored her existence when she was broken now competed with the fervor of treasure hunters who had discovered buried gold. Breeding operations offered contracts that would ensure her offspring carried price tags befitting her legendary bloodline, while private buyers spoke of providing her with facilities that Marcus could never hope to match. Each conversation felt like a negotiation for Phoenix's soul, reducing her transformation to market value and investment potential. The callers spoke enthusiastically about her bloodline, her breeding prospects, her potential contribution to the racing industry. But their words rang hollow because they had never seen her pressed against the back wall of her stall, trembling at the sound of approaching footsteps. They hadn't witnessed the months of patient work required to convince her that human hands could offer comfort instead of pain. Marcus found himself studying Phoenix with new intensity, searching for signs of what she might want if the choice were somehow hers to make. Her behavior had become a barometer of the stress that permeated the air around them, her movements more cautious, her trust more carefully rationed. The visitors meant well, but their presence transformed her sanctuary into something that felt dangerously similar to that auction house where her journey had begun. The financial security that these offers represented could solve every problem that kept Marcus awake at night, could transform his struggling facility into something stable and sustainable. He could continue his work with other damaged horses, could help more animals like Phoenix find their way back from the brink of despair. The logical choice seemed obvious, the responsible decision clear. but watching Phoenix retreat slightly toward the back of her stall when strangers approached, seeing the way her eyes tracked every new face with the wariness of someone who had learned that change often brought suffering, Marcus understood that logic and responsibility were luxuries that required ignoring the most important voice in this conversation. Phoenix had already been bought and sold based on other people's assessments of her value. She had been reduced to a commodity, treated as an investment that had failed to perform as expected. The idea of subjecting her to that experience again, even with the best intentions and highest offers, felt like the ultimate betrayal of everything they had built together. The choice, Marcus realized, wasn't really about money or facilities or breeding potential. It was about whether Phoenix's healing would be honored or exploited, whether her trust would be protected or leveraged for someone else's gain. The choice that would define both their futures emerged not from complex calculations or external pressures, but from the simple understanding that some bonds transcend market value and transform obligation into purpose. Marcus made his decision on a quiet Tuesday morning while watching Phoenix work with a new arrival, a traumatized gelding who had been rescued from conditions that mirrored her own dark past. There was something profound in the way she positioned herself between the frightened animal and the humans trying to help, her body language communicating safety in a language older than words. She had become what Marcus had never expected when he raised his hand at that auction, not just a success story, but a teacher whose lessons came from lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. The phone calls to decline the lucrative offers were surprisingly easy to make once Marcus understood what Phoenix was meant to become. Instead of selling her to the highest bidder, he began transforming his modest facility into something entirely new, a rehabilitation center built around the revolutionary concept that healing trauma required not just professional expertise, but the guidance of those who had walked the same dark paths and emerged whole. Phoenix became the cornerstone of what would eventually be known as the Second Chance Equine Center, her story serving as both inspiration and proof of concept for techniques that prioritized emotional healing alongside physical recovery. The methodology that Marcus had developed through months of patient work with her became the foundation for helping other horses whose spirits had been systematically broken by human cruelty or neglect. Word spread through networks of rescue organizations and veterinary practices about the remarkable transformations happening at the small facility where an auction reject had become the lead instructor in a curriculum of healing. Horses arrived from across the country, each carrying their own catalog of trauma, each needing to learn the same fundamental lesson that Phoenix had mastered, that trust was possible even after the deepest betrayal. Years later, visitors to the center would find Phoenix in the main paddock, her coat now gleaming with the health and vitality that proper care had restored, but more importantly, her eyes reflecting the quiet confidence of an animal who had found her true purpose. She worked with each new arrival as if she understood their fear intimately, positioning herself as a bridge between their traumatic past and the possibility of a future built on different foundations. The transformation was complete in ways that transcended her individual healing. Phoenix had evolved from victim to mentor, from broken spirit to guiding light, proving that sometimes the most rejected become the most transformative when given the opportunity to turn their survival into service. The scared mare who had trembled in the corner of her stall now stood as living testament to the possibility of redemption, not just for herself, but for every animal who would follow in her footsteps. Marcus often found himself watching her work with younger horses, teaching them through example that humans could be trusted, that food would always be available, that safety wasn't just a temporary condition, but a permanent state they could learn to inhabit. In those moments, he understood that his $50 bid at that long-ago auction had purchased something infinitely more valuable than a horse. It had bought into a vision of healing that would ripple outward for generations. The rejected auction horse had become exactly what she was always meant to be, not despite her trauma, but because of how she had chosen to transform it into wisdom that could light the way for others walking similar paths through darkness toward hope. If you enjoyed watching Phoenix's incredible transformation from auction reject to healing mentor, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience and redemption in the horse world. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.